So what I'm going to do today, and my goal is to give you some high-level background and perspective on the healthcare industry, which is the topic of the conference this quarter. And I'm going to do that in a couple of ways. First, I want to start broadly by looking at employment in the healthcare industry. And then I'm going to focus on some particular types of firms in this industry, firms that are operating at the intersection of healthcare and technology. And then finally, I'm going to talk about how some things have changed for the types of care services and providers. Particularly, I'm going to look at telehealth, nursing home, and home healthcare, and the transition between the two that we're seeing in the data. And then finally, talk about consolidation in the industry. So before I get too much further, when I say the healthcare industry, what do I mean? Who counts as being in the healthcare industry? And these classifications you're seeing are from the NAICS, so the North American Industry Classification System. There are more subsectors than what I'm showing you, but this gives you an overall sense of the types of firms that are in this industry. There are three major subcategories within the healthcare industry: ambulatory healthcare services. So this is going to include things like offices of healthcare practitioners, so physicians, dentists, diagnostics labs, home healthcare services, ambulances. The second main subcategory includes hospitals, and the third includes nursing and residential care facilities. So now that we know who's in the industry, it's time to look at some not unemployment, time to look at some employment trends. And there are a couple of ways to think about the employment trends. We can look at raw levels, so the number of people employed in these industries, or we can look at employment in healthcare as a fraction of overall employment. And first, we're going to look at levels. So this chart is a little bit sparse on purpose. It's showing you levels of employment in healthcare overall, that's the reddish orange color, and in the three main subsectors that I mentioned earlier. So ambulatory healthcare services, nursing and residential, and hospitals. And I'm not showing you the x-axis because I want you to see if you can guess where the recessions are. Maybe it will help a little bit if I reveal the latest year of data. And if you look at where the recessions are, they're here, 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 and of course here. Let me reveal the x-axis. So in some ways, this chart is sort of boring because they're all lines that are just going up and up and up. But because of that, they're also very interesting lines at the same time. Over the past few business cycles, employment in healthcare overall didn't actually fall during the recession. Now, this recession is a little bit different. Employment in healthcare did fall about 9.8% in the February to April 2020 timeframe versus an overall decline of about 14.7%. So healthcare did fall less than employment overall. Now that we've looked at some trends in the levels of employment, what about employment in healthcare relative to overall employment? And that's what this chart is showing you here. It's showing you employment in healthcare as a percent of total non-farm employment in buckets of 5 years. And you can see that over time, healthcare employment has grown as a fraction of total employment from about 8% in the early 1990s to about over 10% more recently. Now, most of this increase occurred from about late 1999, 2000 until about 2010. A couple of reasons. One sort of mechanical reason is that employment in healthcare didn't fall during the 2001 or the 2007 to 2009 recessions. So that's going to increase employment in healthcare as a fraction of overall employment. And also there were some changes to healthcare policy during this time. Think about, for example, Medicare and Part D. So if you look at the number of firms, these are numbers of people. So if you look at the number of firms, you get a similar story. From about 2000 until 2017, the number of firms overall increased by about 6%, but the number of firms in healthcare increased by about 20%. So I want to stick with firms. And this time I want to look at a particular kind of firm, firms that are operating at the intersection of healthcare and technology. And these types of firms seem to be getting a lot of attention recently. In the past couple of months, I've had the opportunity to learn about different types of firms and technologies in this area. So for example, there are firms that are using wearable technologies and other remote monitoring tools to allow clinical trials to run without much need for patients or participants to come into clinics. And there are also technologies that have developed computer algorithms and monitoring mechanisms that help doctors figure out which patients in a hospital need immediate care, and also to help predict which patients are likely in the very near future to need certain types of care. So these are very exciting developments. But like with the healthcare industry I told you about before, how are we going to define healthcare technology? And if you think back to those NAICS codes, nothing really jumped out as technology, at least not to me. So instead, what I'm going to do is to use a company called Capital IQ. This is a company that provides information about other public and private companies. Now, it might not capture the universe of all companies, but it will allow us to see the key patterns. And Capital IQ does have a healthcare technology company category. So who are these companies? If you look at their NAICS codes, they're actually not in the healthcare industry. So we're looking at a different set of firms here. If you were to categorize these into their NAICS codes, you would get that they fall into categories such as software and publishing, data processing and hosting services, and computer systems design and related services. So this chart is showing you the number of firms categorized by Capital IQ as a healthcare technology company founded each year since 2000. And what you can see is that there is an uptick starting around 2009. Now, why might this be? There are a number of potential reasons. One could be that people are innovating at the end of the 2007 to 2009 recession. Some could be policy. For example, there was legislation around this time that encouraged the adoption of electronic health records. Also note that the number of firms in the healthcare technology sector coincides with the time when employment in healthcare was growing as a fraction of overall employment. And in terms of why we see a decline starting around, let's say, 2014-15, I don't have a great story for this. So this is something we can ask our panelists about and our keynote speaker about at the end of this conference. So the point of showing you this chart is to make the case that when we think about healthcare technology, this is not necessarily a trend that jumped up in the last 1 to 2 or 3 years. It's more of a trend that's been going on over the past decade or so. But there's at least one trend that a lot of people are talking about that is a trend, a very recent trend over just the past year, and that's the use of telehealth. So a quick aside, this chart is showing you telehealth. Telemedicine is typically thought of as a subset of telehealth. So telemedicine usually specifically refers to remote clinical services. Telehealth is a little bit more broad. This chart is showing you the fraction of visits that are telehealth visits from 2 different sources. The gold line is from fee-for-service Medicare primary care visits, and the blue line is from individuals with commercial health insurance, put together by a partnership between Peterson and the Kaiser Family Foundation. And while the sources are a little bit different, the samples are a little bit different, Medicare versus commercial insurance, both tell the same story. But before the pandemic, there was very little telehealth use. In the middle of 2020, telehealth use jumped up substantially and has come down since then, but at least based on the data we have, looks to be holding at a higher level than what we saw before the pandemic. And for the final settling point, we'll sort of have to wait and see. But we can think about from a demand, supply, and policy perspective why we're seeing this pattern. And then that will help us think about the extent to which telehealth will be prevalent in the future going forward. So in terms of demand, it seems like to some extent, people have changed their preferences in wanting to consume more care remotely or not wanting to go into a hospital or clinic. On the supply side, at least during the worst part of the pandemic, some offices were actually closed and were only offering telehealth or telemedicine services. From a policy perspective, specifically with Medicare, there were some changes in 2020 that increased the ability to use and utilize and pay for telehealth services. So the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services expanded temporarily the range of situations in which health visits could be reimbursed and the rate at which those could be reimbursed. And some of these changes were made permanent at the end of 2020 for rural areas. So telehealth was a very recent change in the type of care people were consuming. What about a longer term change? So that is what seems to be a shift from nursing facilities to care consumed at home. So this chart shows you levels of employment in two particular sectors within the healthcare industry: home healthcare services in blue and nursing care facilities in orangey red. And I'm showing you this very long time frame because I want to make a couple points. One is so that you can see the very long-term persistent upward trend in home healthcare employment and the upward but then turning downward trend in employment in nursing care facilities starting around 2010. So if you focus on the short run and look at the pandemic time period, those short run patterns kind of match up with the long run patterns. And this is what I mean by that. In the February, March, April timeframe, employment in both of those sectors did fall. But if you look towards the recovery, employment in nursing care facilities continued its downward trend, so continued to fall, whereas employment in home health care services turned the corner from its pandemic recession decline and has been increasing since. So why could this be? Again, this could be some kind of preference change. People might now have shifted towards preferring consuming healthcare or consuming home healthcare services. There's a general sense in the policy world that home healthcare might be more efficient than care received in a nursing facility because you don't have to pay for all of the overhead. You just pay for the care you need. There's less need to travel. So those are some reasons for the trends we're seeing in these two sectors. I want to end by looking at consolidation. So here we're talking about the number of firms, so think number of companies that fall into the various healthcare NAICS subsectors. So those three main subsectors I showed you at the very beginning: nursing and residential care facilities, ambulatory healthcare services, and hospitals, and also one subcategory within ambulatory healthcare services, and that's the gold line, offices of physicians. And this chart is showing you the number of firms, again, think number of companies in these sectors and subsectors. So you can see that while the number of firms in ambulatory healthcare services is increasing or maybe a little bit flat, the number of physicians' offices, which is a subcategory, has been falling since about 2008. Also, the number of nursing and residential care facilities firms has been increasing, but the most notable trend, at least to me in this chart, is the number of firms that are hospitals has been falling over time. And this is consistent with consolidation, both horizontal, where two physicians' practices merge or two hospitals merge, and also vertical consolidation, in which a hospital, for example, buys a physician's practice. So what does this mean for consumers? It could mean higher prices. There's some research that post-acquisition prices received for care and services from physicians' practices that merged goes up. Could be because of better negotiating power. Also, a summary of information put together by the Kaiser Family Foundation reviewed a number of research papers on this topic and concluded that mergers generally increase the costs of care received. And this is consistent with what we might predict. With fewer providers, there's less competition, which means more market power and potentially more negotiating power. But also note that higher prices could reflect positive changes to the quality of care. Though the academic research and also research reviewed by the Kaiser Family Foundation is a little bit mixed on this, so I don't think there is a strong conclusion or consensus one way or another. The effects of consolidation in the industry are also something we can address in our panel and during question and answers. Now, will this trend continue? Will we continue to see consolidation in the healthcare industry? That's going to depend a lot on antitrust scrutiny, which has been higher in this sector in recent years. Costs also might favor, or I should say cost might favor consolidations. There's some research that finds that merged hospitals do have lower costs post-merger. The pandemic did cause a big drop in healthcare spending last year in 2020, and some smaller practices or hospitals might be in financially precarious positions and situations and may make it more difficult for them to operate on their own going forward. Now, we haven't seen a spike in mergers and acquisitions yet, so we'll sort of have to wait and see how this unfolds. So to sum up, hopefully this gave you some sense of the big picture of the healthcare industry and a better sense of where the industry was, is, and is going. In terms of long-term trends that stand out, healthcare is a growing share of the economy measured by jobs or the number of firms. And there does seem to be a shift from nursing home care to nursing home care to care consumed at home healthcare services, if you look at the number of employees in these different sectors. In terms of trends that we have seen that have accelerated, telehealth has been noted. And I put consolidation with a question mark, and I want to stress question mark because we don't really know yet. Now, in terms of economic growth in the economy going forward, I think there are strong, slow-moving forces like demographics from the aging of the population, and also the role of the government through Medicare and Medicaid that will likely continue to make healthcare a growing industry for the number of jobs and the number of firms. So that is what I have to share with you today.